In October of 2025, Microsoft quietly closed the book on one of the most widely used pieces of software in human history. Windows 10, the operating system running on hundreds of millions of computers, stopped receiving free security updates. For most users, that would have just meant time to upgrade. But there was a catch. Millions of those computers were not allowed to upgrade, not because they were broken, not because they were slow, but because of a small security chip most people had never heard of, and a decision inside Microsoft that would end up pushing an unprecedented wave of everyday users towards something they'd spent decades ignoring: Linux. To understand why this became such a flashpoint, you have to go back to July 2015, the launch of Windows 10. Microsoft marketed it as the last version of Windows you'd ever need, an operating system meant to evolve continuously rather than get replaced every few years. For nearly a decade, that promise mostly held up. Windows 10 became the default OS on a huge share of the world's PCs. But every piece of software eventually reaches end of life, and Microsoft set that date for Windows 10 as October 14, 2025. After that point, retail Windows 10 Home and Pro editions stopped receiving routine monthly security patches. Machines would still boot, they'd still run, but they'd be increasingly exposed to unpatched vulnerabilities over time. Normally, this is where users would just upgrade to the next version, Windows 11, and move on. Except this time, a huge number of otherwise perfectly functional computers weren't eligible to migrate to 11. Here's the technical heart of the controversy. Windows 11 requires a component called TPM 2.0, Trusted Platform Module, along with UEFI Secure Boot and a fairly recent processor. TPM isn't something Microsoft invented. It's an industry security standard that's existed since the early 2000s, essentially a tiny separate computer on your motherboard that stores encryption keys somewhere malware can't easily reach. Microsoft's official explanation is that TPM 2.0 enables real security features, BitLocker drive encryption, Windows Hello facial and fingerprint login, and protection against rootkits that tamper with your boot process. Company representatives have called the requirement non-negotiable, framing it as a necessary part of a broader zero-trust security strategy. That's the official story. But here's the problem. TPM 2.0 support only became a standard inclusion on new PCs after 2016. So if you bought a computer before then, even a computer that runs beautifully today, there's a good chance it simply lacks the chip, full stop. No firmware update fixes that. It's not a switch you can flip. It's a piece of hardware that either exists on your motherboard or it doesn't. So picture the actual user experience. You've got a 5, 6, 7-year-old laptop. It opens your browser fine. It runs your spreadsheets fine. It plays your music, edits your photos, does everything you need. Then one day, Windows tells you your PC doesn't meet the requirements for Windows 11, and your current operating system is running out of support. To enthusiast communities and everyday users alike, that landed as a forced hardware refresh dressed up as a security update. Multiple independent analyses estimated that somewhere between 200 million and 400 million PCs worldwide could not perform a supported upgrade to Windows 11 without new hardware. A staggering number of machines rendered technically obsolete, not because they stopped working, but because of a compliance checkbox. There was also a quieter option, Microsoft's Extended Security Updates program, letting Windows 10 machines keep getting patches for a fee, starting somewhere in the neighborhood of $30 to $60 per device for the first year and increasing after that. For a lot of people, paying an annual fee just to keep using the computer they already owned felt like the wrong kind of solution. This is where things escalated beyond the usual tech forum grumbling. Online communities began actively documenting workarounds, registry edits, third-party tools, and modified installers designed to bypass the TPM and secure boot checks entirely. Tech outlets ran step-by-step guides confirming these bypasses still worked even on the most recent Windows 11 builds. But bypassing the check comes with a real cost. PCs running Windows 11 on unsupported hardware don't get automatic feature updates, and you lose the actual security benefits TPM was supposed to provide in the first place. BitLocker falls back to weaker software-based key storage. Windows Hello loses its hardware backing. In other words, the workaround only patches over the symptom, not the underlying tension. For students, budget-conscious households, schools, and small organizations without deep IT budgets, none of the available paths, buy new hardware, pay for extended updates, or run an insecure workaround, felt like a real solution. And that frustration is exactly the gap that Linux distributions were about to step into. On the exact same day Windows 10 support ended, October 14, 2025, a Linux distribution called Zorin OS released its newest version, Zorin OS 18. That timing wasn't a coincidence. Zorin has spent years building a specific reputation, a Linux desktop deliberately designed to look and feel like Windows, easing the psychological jump for people who've never touched a non-Microsoft operating system in their lives. Zorin OS 18 shipped with a Windows-like layout option out of the box, direct OneDrive file browsing built into its file manager, and an updated compatibility layer for running many Windows programs without needing to dual boot or install a virtual machine. The results were immediate. Zorin reported 100,000 downloads in a little over 2 days, with more than 70% of those downloads reportedly coming from Windows machines. Within about 5 weeks, that number crossed 1 million. Within 3 months, it passed 2 million. And by the time Zorin released its follow-up update, Zorin OS 18.1, roughly 6 months after the original launch, the project said it had crossed 3.3 million total downloads. Now, in the interest of being accurate rather than sensational, because this is meant to be a news piece, not a Linux commercial, it's worth pausing on what that 3.3 million figure actually means. A download is not the same thing as an install. It's not the same thing as a daily active user. Some of those downloads were people testing Zorin in a virtual machine out of curiosity. Some were repeat downloads from the same person across multiple devices. Some were installer files grabbed and never actually used. What the download numbers do prove reliably is a massive spike in real active curiosity. Millions of individual people, in a very short window, making the deliberate decision to go looking for an alternative to Windows. Whether that curiosity turns into a durable, lasting shift in desktop market share is a separate, harder question. One that depends on driver support, software compatibility, and whether new Linux users stick around after the initial experiment. Zorin isn't operating in a vacuum here. Broader tracking services have shown Linux's overall desktop share creeping up from its traditionally tiny 1 to 3% range into the low single digits worldwide, with some regional snapshots in the US showing Linux exceeding 5% during parts of 2025. Gaming-focused surveys like Valve's hardware survey for Steam have shown similar upward movement. None of this means Windows is in any danger of losing its dominant position anytime soon. Windows still runs the overwhelming majority of desktop and laptop computers on Earth. But for a platform that spent 2 decades stuck in a rounding error range, even a modest multi-point climb, driven directly by a single vendor's policy decision, is a meaningful data point, and a real signal that when a company creates enough friction, users will go looking for the exit. So where does this leave things? Microsoft has been clear that it has no plans to walk back the TPM 2.0 and secure boot requirements. The company continues to describe them as foundational to its long-term security roadmap, including newer AI-integrated Copilot Plus hardware that leans even further into dedicated security silicon. That means the pressure pushing users toward alternatives isn't going away. If anything, each future Windows release is likely to raise the hardware floor further, not lower it. On the other side, distributions like Zorin, along with long-time favorites like Linux Mint and Ubuntu, are clearly leaning into this moment, investing specifically in features that lower the switching cost for ordinary, non-technical users. Not just hobbyists and developers who would have made the jump years ago regardless. Whether this becomes a genuine structural shift in how the world uses personal computers, or just a temporary spike that fades once people's Windows 10 machines eventually get replaced anyway, is something we'll only really be able to answer with a few more years of data. But for the first time in a long time, that question is actually worth asking seriously.